Hi there. I'm coming on to say it is day 24 since our mom was taken in the dark of night from her bed. And every hour and minute and second and every long night has been agony since then of worrying about her and fearing for her and aching for her and most of all just missing her.
84-year-old Nancy Guthrie was reported missing on February 1st, 2026. There's no breaking news here. She was abducted by persons unknown. The FBI has offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to her recovery. Please do not call tip lines and flood them any more than they're flooded already with information that you may think is relevant, but really has nothing to do with this case. I also want to say that today's theme music is Mirror by New Alchemist. And I want to welcome back my pod partner, Neil Young. Hi, Neil. Welcome to the show. Hi.
How you doing?
Well, I'm good. I missed you. I was fiddling around with the platform. It's amazing how 2 weeks away just means you can't handle the buttons anymore. So, Neil, let's start. Oh, wait, before we start the news roundup, I just want to say I just got off X, and you're not going to believe this, but Nancy Mace and Lauren Boebert are putting up selfies of themselves on the way to depose Hillary Clinton in Chautauqua.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Chappaqua. That's where they live. It is so crazy. And since we're actually going to be talking about media spectacles today, and the Nancy Guthrie kidnapping has turned into a media spectacle, it just occurred to me, everything's a media spectacle. I mean, can you imagine Joe McCarthy taking selfies of himself on his way to depose witnesses? I mean, it's just absurd. Okay, so let's talk about the news. With a hat tip to journalist Erin Reed, we have a late-breaking report from Kansas that a bill passed over Democratic Governor Laura Kelly's veto has invalidated the driver's licenses of trans people across the state. Those driver's licenses are to be surrendered by the end of business today. This has been banging around the Kansas legislature for well over 2 years, almost 3 years. Senate Bill 244 requires that all driver's licenses reflect sex at birth, and there is no grace period for updating credentials. Neil, what are the consequences for people who suddenly have their driver's licenses lifted?
Well, this is just a really chilling news item, I think. I mean, this, we hear about sort of anti-trans legislation all the time, and sort of, the broad anti-trans politics that, has had such passion and movement behind it for the last couple of years. But there's particular aspects, and this is one that just feels really chilling, and sort of like the government going out of its way to send letters to folks that it knows. So I guess because it can track this via changes made to a driver's license. But the documentation like this would be rendered immediately invalid, and that these folks have to come forward and, get their, proper license in the state's judgment. Just feels like a really chilling surveillance, and also one that is probably bigger than the driver's license itself. And even this part about there being, rendered, what's the language, immediately invalid.
Yep.
So how is one supposed to get to the DMV to make that change? I mean, like, technically they'd be breaking the law. Like, they've been told that their license is no longer valid. I think, what else do you see here, Claire, that we should be concerned about? Because this feels bigger than like one piece of government paper. It's a bigger project.
Well, as you know, Neil, I tend not to make grandiose statements like that. It feels like Nazi Germany to me. I mean, basically, people's proof of citizenship
Yeah.
is being lifted. They cannot board an airplane. They cannot go to the bank and cash a check. They cannot go to the liquor store and buy a very much needed bottle of vodka at this point. There are a range of things you cannot do without a driver's license. You cannot vote without a driver's license in many states. And yes, people have jobs. People have children to take to school. People have medical appointments. All of those will now have to be done by Lyft or Uber or the grace of friends, unless people take a chance and drive without a license, which makes them subject not just to fines, but to imprisonment.
Yeah.
And Kansas also has a law that if you are imprisoned, you are put in a cell with the people who are the gender that you were sexed as at birth. There's also a nasty little clause in this legislation that awards a bounty of $1,000 to anyone uncovering a transgender person in a bathroom that the state says they're not supposed to be in. Which, not to get overly dramatic or to say this is about me, but, I get misgendered in the bathroom all the time. And the fine has to be paid by the person who is identified. So that puts a range of people who could be misidentified, primarily butch lesbians, as men, in danger. It's also really quite weird because one of the things I wonder is why women and politicians who say they're working on behalf of women want trans men in women's bathrooms. It's like trans men keep falling out of the conversation.
Well, what they want is for them to disappear and to
Right.
particularly disappear from public life. And this is a way to not like completely bring that about, but to certainly shape
Right.
visibility and
Right.
and the public lives that folks live and the sort of freedom and liberty they have to go about their normal course of life. And so that's at work here. That's
Yep.
very much part of the strategy. But I think you're right to make that comparison to Nazi Germany. I mean, I think you and I are both restrained in sort of bringing that analogy in. It gets overused and overworked a lot. But this and we can find other examples of this, but sort of the broad and the sort of strategic attack on basic elements of citizenship is really at work here. And I think it's like accumulating in all different examples, but the consequence is profound, and I think one that we should not hesitate to really speak to its real historical meaning, and the way in which something like Nazi Germany might be the only point of reference at some point.
Yeah, I mean, I can't help but think that somebody's going to go to court and they're going to get a stay for this. I'll be looking for that, and we'll update it on the Political Junkie Substack. But it is truly terrifying. And the book I read about Anne Frank by Ruth Franklin, which is a great biography of Anne Frank and a biography of the book she wrote. One of the things Franklin describes is the narrowing of the worlds that Jews could inhabit. Mm-hmm. So, Jews were not allowed to go to anyone but Jewish doctors, and Gentiles were not allowed to go to Jewish doctors at all. Okay, so that happens. Jewish professors are kicked out of the university. Jewish students are kicked out of the university. And at every stage, Jews try to make do in this smaller and smaller world. Now, unlike the transgender people of Kansas, there is often nowhere to go, and transgender Kansans can leave. But it's a horrific penalty to have to pay for simply living the life that you belong in.
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, so our second news item, slightly less depressing, but a little weird, or maybe it is just as depressing, I don't know. On Wednesday, Dr. Casey Means came before a Senate committee charged with vetting her for the position of Surgeon General of the United States. Means, you may recall, is a wellness influencer and popular author who dropped out of her surgical residency. She no longer has a license to practice medicine because she gave it up because she didn't need it, because she's just an influencer. And she promotes the idea that individuals, not doctors, are the experts on their own bodies. We might want to return to that point a little bit, because that is something that actually arose in feminism and now has been taken over by the MAHA movement.
Yeah.
So she's very MAHA herself. When asked about vaccines, she refused to commit to any position on vaccines. I also learned when I was researching this that the United States does not currently have a Surgeon General. I didn't know that. Did you know that, Neil?
I didn't realize it either. I mean, it's like, how does one keep track of this cast of clowns? And some of them are not even in their official clown roles, but it's being, this
They're
role
not
has
wearing
been,
their red noses yet.
right. The role has been temporarily filled, right, by this woman, Stephanie Herodopoulos, right?
And who is she?
Well, she's a Florida family practice physician.
Okay.
And so she's been appointed as acting chief of staff, senior advisor to the U.S. Surgeon General. She's also married to a Republican congressman from Florida named Mike Herodopoulos. I hope I'm saying that last name correctly. And what's sort of interesting about the fact that this role hasn't been filled, this may be the longest that the post has remained vacant from what we understand, right? And this role, the Surgeon General position, goes back to 1879. And it's usually filled by a very high-ranking physician in the military who has their medical license and all the things. But not surprising at all that Casey Means is the person being put forward by this administration.
Yeah, and I had thought that Surgeon General was kind of an analogy to Attorney General. And, an Attorney General is not really a general. But as it turns out, Surgeon Generals are often not just generals, but sometimes admirals or commodores or, whatever. And looking at it, it really made sense to me, because if in fact you are a very high-ranking military officer and a physician, you are used to running a major organization where everybody's health matters. And, the idea, and for some reason, this sort of struck me as particularly feckless. The idea that you can just stick an ordinary person who, from your point of view, has a lot of common sense. And, even the Stephanie Herodopoulos character, I mean, she won an award in Florida for being like Family Physician of the Year. And I think family physicians are great. They don't run large organizations.
Right.
So it's really, really terrifying. I don't know what's going to happen to Casey Means. I hope that Bill Cassidy has learned his lesson from voting yes on RFK Jr. I mean, Bill Cassidy is a senator from Tennessee. He's also a real physician. So I'm hoping against hope that this will not clear the committee, and perhaps that's why we've been without a Surgeon General for so long.
Yes, just Cassidy's from Louisiana.
But, sorry. Yeah.
I know it's all the same to you, Claire, but
ask a Southerner.
Exactly. There's like miles of difference for me between those two places. But yeah, I mean, famous last words of this entire past year of hoping one particular element of the Republican Party has at last learned their lesson and seen what's truly at work. But yeah, I mean, Cassidy should, and Casey Means is a really scary person. I mean, the Surgeon General is the public spokesperson for medical and public health issues in the country, and presides over an enormous bureaucracy, a bureaucracy that's being reduced as everything else is, but nevertheless, and is supposed to be advising on things like vaccines and just basic public health measures, all of which we don't have clear information from Casey Means, her level of, belief in those things or her adherence to those as scientific practice. So not good.
Yeah, not good at all. All right, let's return to more not good, which is Donald Trump's State of the Union speech on Tuesday night. Neil, did you listen to it?
No, of course not. I went to the
No.
neighbors for dinner.
Right. No, we watched Tehran, that Israeli action show about the Mossad. That
Yeah.
seemed like a more moral thing to do at the moment. Okay, so it was 108 minutes long. It was the longest State of the Union ever. It broke the record held by guess who, Neil?
Maybe Donald Trump himself.
Oh, yes, because it was the best, after the best. Yes, Donald Trump State of the Union last year was 100 minutes long. There's a transcript that we will link to listeners in case you want to know. I've also linked to a highlights document. What struck you about, your sort of glance over at the coverage of the State of the Union, Neil?
Well, the length of it, I mean, I think there's something about this man's need to be in the spotlight and to take up all the air for so long that, is of the psychology that we know him to have. But just the debasement of what this is supposed to represent. And we've talked about over and over how Trump has demeaned and debased the office over and over again, and this is like the latest example of it. Like coming there to hurl insults at an entire political party, demanding that folks in the chamber, stand in applause for certain lines he gives. That sort of harassment and haranguing and just like bloviating showmanship is par for the course for him, but it also seems to cross a new line in making the State of the Union akin to like the rallies he holds with his base. And a lot of people have made this point, and I think it's a smart one. Like, we're, I don't know, 8-9 months away from a midterm election, and the leader of the nation and also of a political party hasn't really given Republicans any clear message of what they're supposed to take to voters over those next months about how to what's the policy that they're behind, what's the message that the party represents, what is the program that they're taking to the people, and all of that's coupled with like really terrible numbers for Trump and for the Republicans. So I don't know what the strategy here is, but it feels like another demonstration of how much the Republicans sort of across the board have signed on to Trump's destruction of sort of everything that exists and the sort of institutional foundations of this country, which include something like the State of the Union address.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that, Neil. And I was also thinking, part of what's weird about this is we saw this television show in the last year of the Biden administration, where Biden got up and started saying, everything's good, everything's great, here's everything we accomplished. And a lot of those things were actually true, things that he'd accomplished, like infrastructure and stuff like that. But the ongoing denial that inflation was bad, the ongoing denial that it is not affordable for most people to carry on as usual. And then I was looking, all right, I watched it, I speeded it up. You can do this on YouTube. You can go to like 3 times speed or 4 times speed or something like that. And what I became fascinated by was 2 things. One is Mike Johnson and J.D. Vance sitting behind Donald Trump, as they do. I think I've told you that my mother basically either can't remember Mike Johnson's name or won't remember Mike Johnson's name. So she calls him Speaker Monkey. And so, which she can remember. And so I kept looking at them and thinking, Mom's right. It is Speaker Monkey and there's Vice President Monkey. And every time Donald Trump said something that was a spectacular lie, they would kind of look at each other and grin and nod. And I couldn't figure out whether it was one of those Ronald Reagan, there he goes again type of things, or whether they were showing support for these lies. It was very ambiguous. So that was one thing I noticed. The other thing I noticed is, of course, one of the first things that happens is that Trump invites the men's field hockey, ice hockey team in. And they all come in and everybody cheers. This took about 15 minutes
Really?
to honor the
my
men's
goodness.
ice hockey team. It was ridiculous. And of course, there was that whole mess about, Trump calling the men's ice hockey team. And he says, come to the White House. Of course, I'm going to have to ask the women too. And all the men laugh, and which they're trying to walk back. Anyway, so watching this whole thing, and of course, winning the gold medal in ice hockey is a very big deal. But they're all men. And then I noticed that practically everybody Trump honored was a man, and every woman who got any attention was basically there for doing something very MAGA female. Like there was a little girl who was rescued. One of the guys who rescued her got the Presidential Medal of Honor or Freedom or something like that. And he rescued 150 little girls from that camp that got flooded in Texas last summer. Anyway, one of the little girls was there. So she was honored as being a victim who was saved. Like a white girl who was saved by a big white man. Then there was another woman who got honored for being pregnant. Because she had gotten IVF through the president's program of making IVF available to people at lower prices. So women were being honored for doing womanly things, like being rescued or being pregnant. And I haven't seen that reported on anywhere.
That's such an interesting thing. And then, Erica Kirk was also there, right? I've seen all these memes of her, scrunching up her face to put on the tears as as a lot of people have been sort of scrutinizing over the last couple of months, her sort of performative grief. But yeah, I think the through line here is whiteness, and then whiteness is very gendered, of sort of heroes and victims, and sort of masculine doing and sort of womanly roles. Not surprising, but I just, this hockey thing is it's sort of making me crazy how much headlines this is grabbing for all the stuff, but so gross. And I think the men have not handled it well, and the women have. Just think that but it's also so terrible that their gold medal has now become this, you know.
Right.
And I saw one of I don't remember her name, but she's getting a lot of attention on social today because there was some sort of press conference and she said something along the lines of I shouldn't have to spend my time talking about this after, winning the gold medal. And she's right.
Right. No, she's absolutely right. And, I also had this weird thought, is elevating the men's hockey team in this way, does have anything to do with the queerification of hockey through heated rivalry? Oh,
interesting. This is the recalibration of it all?
Yeah. Nothing to see here. No one's gay.
Really interesting. Yeah, maybe so. Hockey has definitely gotten a lot of attention this year. That's for sure.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things, I know you don't like it, Neil, I read the book while I was on vacation, and now I'm making my way through the television series, and I agree with you, it's not very good. But one of the things I think is interesting is there's a lot of complaining about in sort of left online queer circles of why are Americans so into a story about men in the closet, right? Mm-hmm. And I kind of thought, well, name one NHL player who's out.
Right.
On a certain level, I don't actually think it's reactionary to talk about athletes in the closet. It's very real. And, men are in the closet at a much higher rate than women are. Women seem to be coming out. Mm-hmm. It is also true that women are paid a great deal less than men are, and they maybe have less at stake. I don't know. Yeah. Or maybe they're just more courageous and smarter and better educated, which is what I usually think. Okay, so primary voting is underway in Texas. Now, this is a biggie we're going to be following for a while, Neil. For the Senate seat currently held by Republican John Cornyn. On the Democratic side, the polls are all over the place. YouGov sees Representative Jasmine Crockett, currently representing Texas's 30th congressional district, in firm command of the Democratic race. Emerson, which is actually a really good poll, it's better than most of the polls they're citing, has James Tallarico in a 9-point lead. Neil, tell us a little something about these candidates and what kind of a contest this is.
Well, James Tallarico is someone we've talked about here and there. We've talked about both these on the podcast before, but James Tallarico, that sort of like, white religious Democrat. I think he's sort of in a, I don't know, maybe a Pete Buttigieg type vein of sort of squeaky clean character who's sort of presenting this very rational sort of I don't know, like I'm the safe bet for Democrats. I feel like that's a lot of the implications of his sort of campaign. I'm sure he has policies too as well, but that's sort of like his public persona. Jasmine Crockett is, as we've talked about on here before, a true star, an absolute just powerhouse in the House of Representatives, someone who I think is incredibly effective in her role, especially in the ways that she has questioned members of the Trump administration when they've come before committees of Congress that she's on. Just a star, a celebrity, someone I think that has like so much charisma and a lot of public support, and so, but like temperamentally, it feels like there's a real difference between these two, right? Sort of the milquetoast guy here, and just this like star power person who gives it to Trump and to the Republicans. And I think in a lot of ways that's her argument too. I saw a post she'd made a day or two ago saying like, basically something along the lines of like, we have to do something different, and I represent something different. And so I think that Crockett has this race sewn up. Like every poll I've seen puts her quite ahead. I mean, this Emerson poll is an interesting one, and certainly Tallarico is getting a ton of attention too. So, but it seems like Crockett is going to win, and I think she represents a really interesting person in this race, given what's happening on the Republican side, and just sort of like as the future of Texas too.
Well, and of course, as we know, primary voters are very motivated voters. So Crockett is going to appeal to that kind of voter. And I think what you're saying about Tallarico, and I want to tell you one thing I really like about Tallarico is he is modeling the idea that you can be Christian and progressive. And very Christian and progressive.
Yeah.
So that is something I want to keep my eye on to see if there are going to be other candidates, particularly popping up in congressional races and state house races across the country, that are taking that tack. I mean, basically, I think the guy would be an independent if that actually made sense in the Senate race. So let's look at the Republican side, because this is where things get hinky. John Cornyn is the incumbent. He's clearly struggling. A lot of people in Texas don't love it that he has not backed the president 100%, although he's voted with the president something like 92% of the time. But every once in a while he says something like, well, I don't think that was a very good idea, which pisses off the MAGA people. But he's running against Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, who seems to have a little adultery problem, a little corruption problem, a little lying problem. He was impeached, which is almost unheard of in Texas, and he's such a powerful guy that, he had to like play all of his cards not to get impeached. And then we have Wesley Hunt, who is a moderate African-American Trumpy guy, sort of, I don't know, like, what's his name in Florida, Byron Donalds type of person. So we have three people. Now, the thing about Texas is in order to win an election, you have to get 50% of the vote. So there is surely going to be a runoff in this particular race. One of the things Cornyn is talking about is that, if in fact that happens, the Democrats will get about a 6-week campaigning leap on the Republicans, and that matters in Texas, which is the size of a small country.
Yeah.
I mean, doing a campaign in Texas is just a nightmare. So what do you see happening here? Paxton's ahead.
It feels like Paxton will win just because of, like, he feels the Trumpiest of these three. But I mean, like, Trump has made this a mess because he basically, and it's sort of odd that he's doing this, but he's said, I like all three.
Right.
You're supposed to pick one, but I like all three in this
Right.
race. And that seems very unlike Trump to not, like, put his large orange thumb on the scale. But it's certainly creating some confusion and some messiness on the Republican side. But Paxton is sort of the Trumpier figure, and Cornyn, who's like easily, I mean, he is the establishment figure. Even if he's like, his voting record aligns with Trump, I think he represents a sort of like, even just visually how he looks, but the fact that he's had sort of multiple terms in the Senate, it's like the country club Republican type. That
Right.
so much of like the Republican base is enraged by, as much as they're enraged by Democrats. So it feels like Paxton would have more of the heat behind him that actually could make
Right.
one come out ahead in a primary. But I do think it's like, what's the voter turnout going to be like for
Right.
Republicans? It's going to be great for Democrats in this state because they are fired up for both of their candidates. But like, voter turnout may be sort of low for Republicans in Texas because none of this is like really exciting them. And in that case, it seems like the numbers suggest there will be a runoff, and that only makes the thing messier. I just think for all the analysis that's being given to Texas over and over again in the last couple of races, yes, Democrats are suddenly within a sort of striking distance of Republicans in Texas, and that's significant. But I still don't think they can pull something off. What do you think, Claire? Like, do you think that this is a winnable seat for a Democrat?
No. I mean, I just
either.
I don't see Texas electing anyone Democratic for a big office anytime soon. I will say one thing, which is Texas Republicans have made it very hard to vote. And this is an election in which there is early voting. Early voting has been going on for 2 weeks.
Yeah.
The ballots have to be in sometime next week, March 4th. And it seems to me that Republicans may have kind of shot themselves in the foot for controlling this primary because you make it hard for people to vote. Only the motivated voters will get there. They reduced ballot boxes by at least a third.
Yeah.
There are counties where you have to drive for, 100 miles to get your vote in. So I think there may be some chickens that are coming home to roost in Texas. What will be interesting is a campaign that faces Jasmine Crockett against Ken Paxton, because we are looking at two people who really know how to do the media. Jasmine Crockett, I don't think we have mentioned, is black. I don't think Texas has ever had a black governor. That will be energizing for many voters, particularly urban voters. And by urban, I'm not using that as a synonym for white. I'm talking about white progressives as well. So I don't know. I think there's a possibility that a Democrat could win this seat, but I think, in fact, it's going to be crazy. I think there's going to be a ton of outside money. And I think the big question is, can you get outside money behind Ken Paxton, who is dangerous and crazy and has actually, has a lot of skeletons in his closet.
Yeah, but I think that's a really important, like the fact that outside money now has to, and that the Republican Party has to pay attention to Texas,
Right.
represents, a shifting of sort of the political playing field in a way that Republicans cannot be happy with, right? They should not be having to like defend Texas or put money into it. So,
That so silly. I mean, John Cornyn could win that race without ever leaving his home.
Seriously.
If they nominated him.
Yeah.
And the whole thing that MAGA has done and turning the voters against the establishment, against people who actually know how to do their job, is really the problem here.
Yeah, and very conservative Republicans, we should say, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
again, it's not like Cornyn is some like
Right.
Rockefeller Republican. Like this is,
Right.
it's really a shooting. They're shooting on themselves, and and I think like we're seeing in real time the destruction this is doing to the country, but also to the party as well.
Right.
But yeah, we'll see. It couldn't happen to a bunch of better folks than
Yeah.
the Republicans in Texas, though. That's
Sure
for
it couldn't. And one of the links I'm dropping into the news roundup is a piece in the Atlantic that talks about this SAVE Act in Congress that wants to require federal ID for voting. And the guy that wrote the article said, Republicans don't seem to understand that they are winning national elections with sporadic voters. And sporadic voters don't know the rules about voting. They are
Yeah.
going to have thousands of people showing up at the
Interesting.
polls in the midterms who have no idea what they are doing. So yes, the snowball is beginning to roll down the hill here. So let's get to our news focus, Neil. One of the reasons I thought we should feature Nancy Guthrie this week, other than the fact that we're into the 4th week of her captivity, is that when I saw Kash Patel partying with the men's gold medal Olympic hockey team, sucking down a beer like Milo says hello to a priest, I thought, what is he doing in Milan when there's this high-profile case that no one can solve? And it's not as if the FBI director is the key to the solution,
Right.
but it's also so unseemly when there is a big case to not be on the scene. So can you talk a little bit more about why Kash Patel's presence in Milan sort of opens up a whole bunch of bigger stories about the FBI that have a bearing on this case?
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, this isn't his first time of being in such a place, right? Like, there's been a number of ways in which a bunch of stories about him using, federal dollars for his own personal travel and entertainment, and really using this, very important position as almost like his calling card to like party on the world stage. And so that's happening. There's also been a ton of reporting about, first of all, just the huge cuts at the FBI to, really taking its workforce down to sort of bare numbers, it being overworked, it being really incapacitated in a lot of ways. People talking about like a culture of fear and paralysis within the agency, in part because folks don't know what to do, and there's so little leadership from the top. And I think in a lot of ways we didn't think Kash Patel was going to last this long in the role. There was lots of stories many months ago now about how he was really unhappy in the position and wanted out. And it seemed like he was headed toward the exit door, but somehow has stuck around. None of this speaks well to how, this incredibly important agency is being run, and just the sort of incompetence of the person in charge. Clearly, he's not spending a lot of time overseeing the search for Nancy Guthrie. Who knows what else he's also not spending a lot of time overseeing that's also deeply important to, law enforcement in this country.
Right. Well, and word has it that the FBI is almost paralyzed by the kind of chaos that Patel has induced, a lack of leadership. And it's worth saying that neither Patel or Dan Bongino, the podcaster who was the associate director of the FBI. I mean, this is crazy.
The podcaster.
The podcaster. Neil, there are job openings everywhere for us. But that neither of these guys had any investigative experience.
Right.
And that is really just shocking. And, if I could take listeners back to a guy I wrote a book about years and years ago, back in the 1990s, J. Edgar Hoover, When he became director of the FBI, the big story was that he was only, 30 years old. And he was so young, and he was replacing a guy named William J. Burns, who was famous for having established the Burns Detective Agency. It was a really big deal in the Civil War, really big deal in terms of defanging the labor movement and so on. But Burns was, incredibly corrupt. And so Hoover comes in, but he had a lot of investigative experience, a decade, in part because he orchestrated the Palmer raids, which was this illegal roundup of radicals in 1920. And so Hoover actually had all this experience, and one of the things he did is he said, the nation's top investigative agency has to be professional from the top down. Every layer has to be professional. Everybody has to have at least a college degree, if not a law degree or an accountant. In other words, the version of conservatism that prevailed at the founding of the FBI was a kind of elitism and a belief in the honesty of the organization. Now, that didn't always prove to be the case, as we know about Hoover. But I saw someone on television the other day who said when she was an FBI agent, the number one rule was never do anything that will embarrass the FBI. Mm-hmm. And Patel has violated that rule over and over again.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's get back to Nancy Guthrie. Neil, can you just remind our audience, I think I said at the top of the show that she's 84 years old, but can you remind our audience about why this has become such a media spectacle?
Well, I think a huge part of that, and maybe the most important part, is that she's the mother of Savannah Guthrie, the NBC News personality and huge star who is really beloved. And so that's highly relevant to just like the interest in her, and also I think the particular media focus around this. I mean, like lots of people go missing all the time and never get any coverage. This is very much a function of the fame and the celebrity that's attached to this story. And I think that it's understandable that NBC News and other news outlets have followed this story so closely because of that connection via Savannah. I also think it just puts into highlight for us some sort of historical commonalities with other big media true crime cases, which I know a lot about, especially we were talking a little bit before we got on the podcast about the Lindbergh baby, and I think there's some really important historical parallels there between this case and that one, don't you, Claire?
I absolutely do, and I think there are two features of this that are worth thinking about. One is both the Lindbergh baby and Nancy Guthrie are sort of quintessentially innocent. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Lindbergh baby was just lying in his crib. Yeah. His parents said goodnight to him, and then the next morning he was gone. And similarly, Nancy Guthrie, she was out to dinner with her children. They dropped her off. And then the next day, somebody called and said, your mom hasn't shown up at, church or whatever. And they went over, there's blood all over the front step. There's signs of a struggle. Their mother is gone. Nancy Guthrie didn't ask to be famous.
Right.
She didn't ask to be the child of a beloved television star. So I think, we can't know, but it seems pretty clear that she was targeted for money. The family has offered a $1 million ransom to get her back. The fact that this has gone on for 4 weeks does not seem good, does it?
No, it indicates that we probably are not going to find her alive, which is just horrible. And and you can understand that the family is doing everything they can to keep attention on their case, as any family would. Right. In such circumstances. They just have a lot more resources available to them, money and a huge resource and media visibility that's really important here. But it doesn't seem to actually in this case be changing the circumstances of the investigation. If anything, I think, a lot of folks have been surprised that, like, so many aspects of, like, the ring footage camera, the ring camera footage took so long to sort of come to come to the investigation. And I think there's a lot of conspiratorial thinkers out there who think, this is part of some big conspiracy. But I think, a lot of this has to do, as what we've been just talking about, sort of like a really diminished FBI that's overseeing this. So lots of really important sort of things that are happening in the country right now seem to converge in this story, even as it also, I think, as we've said, like, revives some real historical trends when it comes to, true crime and media spectacle and the cases that really grab the public imagination, like this one.
Right. Well, and it's hard to think of the Lindbergh kidnapping in the context of new media, but it is important to remember that when the Lindbergh baby was kidnapped, which I think was 1930, there was, first of all, a lot of panic about immigrants. And the person who was ultimately arrested was a German immigrant, and he was convicted of the crime, although his wife said he couldn't have done it, and that there has remained some ambiguity over the years. But more importantly, the 1920s is sort of like the decade when tabloid culture comes into being. There were all these tabloid newspapers. There's radio, which is a relatively new medium. There are newsreels. So there's all of this, what is for 1930 new media, talking about the case, getting people ginned up. There is the FBI, which is actually becoming a big deal in popular culture. Hoover has been advertising them, so people are sending in tips all the time. There's an overworked New Jersey State Police force. And I think we're seeing similarly in the Guthrie case that our media environment, social media, is playing a huge role. I don't know whether you've seen any of those Instagram reels of some woman grabbing her water bottle and to the tune of the CSI theme walking out the door and saying, "Okay, girls, we're going out to find Nancy Guthrie." No. Like there is this, I know it's so gross, but also that we live in a culture where information spreads so quickly and misinformation spreads so quickly. So the speculation about what has happened in Nancy has had consequences for all kinds of innocent people, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also that, like, anyone with a phone can participate in this, right? In both the sort of investigation and the media coverage of it. I mean, that is an enormous transformation in how, like, for the bulk of for all of the 20th century, for example, a crime would be investigated and covered. So you have sort of a democratization, but that democratization comes with huge cost here in terms of just, like, clogging up the investigative process, creating, I think, a sort of chaos around distribution of information and misinformation, as you say. And I think just, like, a further eroding of public trust that I think is a real important byproduct of this.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, I would also say there are just enough stories out there of citizen investigators breaking cases. And I would have to say our own industry is fully implicated in this. Podcasters who prove people innocent. The number of amateurs that went to work on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram finding the January 6th people. A lot of that was people turned in by their neighbors, by their coworkers, by their family members who saw on social media, oh yeah, that's my dad, that's my coworker, and called the FBI and turned them in. So there are just enough examples of citizens playing an extremely useful role in investigations that when it then converges on an elderly lady who is simply disappeared. I mean, the New York Post is reporting today that the FBI is doing a final sweep of their house, or of her house, to turn it back over to the family, which really indicates that they're at a dead end.
Yeah.
They're doing digital forensics. They're doing something called genetic genealogy. Apparently, they found a glove that they think might match the glove that the guy at the Ring camera was wearing. And you can do that. You can build a family tree and maybe get back, but then you have to have enough DNA in order
Right.
to really do that. So it sounds like the ordinary investigative techniques have turned up nothing, and that when she is found, it will be an accident. So Neil, I also learned something interesting, which is that kidnapping has upwards of a 90% clearance rate. Did you know that?
That really surprises me because you think of like, I don't know, I just would not have guessed that number.
Right.
I mean, you think of just like all those kids on the back of the milk cartons, right?
Right. Right.
And the commercials and all that. But how is that the case?
Well, apparently, first of all, adults are kidnapped very rarely in this
Right.
country. They're kidnapped more frequently in other countries where you have sort of weak states, and ransoming people is sort of
Yeah.
part of what organized crime does. But in this country, children have either run away. A lot of those kids on the back of the milk cartons are runaways. But most frequently, they're snatched by relatives.
Right.
So you have a nice pool of suspects that usually
Yeah.
yields the culprit almost immediately. And so targeting adults is very, very rare. And that's one of the things that makes me think that the sort of collapse of the FBI as a functioning unit may in fact be a factor in this case, because it's not something that happens often enough that everybody knows how to investigate a kidnapping.
Yeah, and I think that like there's all sorts of ways that, as we keep talking about, this FBI just really seems, out of its depth and also really under-resourced in this moment. This is a horrible, horrible story, and certainly our hearts go out to her and any other families seeking, dealing with such circumstances. I do think, and I hope this doesn't sound like cynical or sort of opportunistic to say, but it does seem like, if someone who's very close to this story is a major, media figure, like, what might Savannah Guthrie do with this as a sort of way of being an agent of reform and really
Right.
putting a spotlight on some, systemic things that really need attention and investigation. I think that's obviously way down the road, but it does just sort of strike me that, she might make this a sort of mission for her in a way that, just given who she is and her resources, might actually lead to something substantial. We'll see. But
I hope
terrible
so.
that she has to, and anyone has to. I can't imagine having your mother pulled from her home like this, and at an age like that, not knowing that they are safe and protected. It's a horrific thing to consider.
I think that's true. And, I would also have to say, it made me think of like, who are the mothers that we often don't think about? And, I think about all those elderly women in Ukraine. And, the elderly women in, my friend Dahlia Lithwick actually went to Israel during the Gaza war because her elderly parents were living there, and there were missiles coming down
Yeah.
all over the place. And the extent to which those of us who are just enough younger to be a little nimble and able to take care of ourselves, the idea that your, 85, 90-year-old mother would be left in such a vulnerable position is really very difficult to contemplate.
Yeah.
All right. Well, listeners, as we say, don't flood the tip lines, don't play amateur detective, but do keep your eye on the FBI. I've been saying since the Charlie Kirk assassination that they don't seem to be doing a very good job. And, as we know, Charlie Kirk's assassin was turned in by his family, was not found by the FBI because they had fired the special agent in charge several months before and put someone in place who had never run a major organization or major investigation. All right. So, Neil, What do we want to go viral this week?
All right, what I want to go viral is a piece from our friend and colleague Natalia Melman-Petruzella. She had an MS Now the other day, which is, I think, is the new name for MSNBC. The piece is called RFK Jr. and Kid Rock's Maha Manosphere Mashup. Natalia's like the best person to write about this stuff as an acclaimed fitness historian and someone who thinks a lot about wellness and culture and politics and gender and the body. This piece is, if you don't know, the Trump administration released this like public health announcement that's like these series of videos, or a video with Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and, the rock star Kid Rock, fresh off of his, Super Bowl halftime counter programming appearance. And they're like doing all these wellness activities. They're like in the sauna together, and they're playing pickleball, and they're doing cold plunge, and a lot of them they're wearing jeans, which is like not what you wear when you work out. There's like guzzling these glasses of whole milk, which is this whole other, weird thing that the Maha folks are obsessed with. Anyway, Natalia comments that the video has gotten a lot of commentary. Basically, most of that commentary has sort of revolved around poking fun at just the ridiculousness and the hypocrisy of these videos, and sort of just the mishmash of mixed messages and just like bad fitness content that these videos are showcasing. But she makes the really important point that like it's not just about the questionable online fitness content in this video, but like, folks, this is an official message from our federal government being paid for with our tax dollars.
Right.
And it is promoting sort of junk science and a real sort of individualistic ethos, even at the moment in which this same administration is carrying out disastrous, draconian, just horrific and like huge cuts to things like science funding and SNAP benefits and the very things that, were long sort of foundational aspects of our public health. And so, that's an incredibly important point that she makes. She also reads a lot of the sort of, she does a great textual analysis of this in ways that I think are really smart, and I'll let people read. But the other thing that I think she points out that's really important is, first of all, she situates this in sort of a long history of public health announcements about from other presidential administrations, and how this is such a departure from those sort of serious, sober-minded, and even sort of optimistic and encouraging messages that other presidential administrations gave to Americans about being fit and being healthy and all those things. But then she also makes this point, like, where are the women? They are completely absent from this public service announcement or this public service video. And also just generally absent from RFK Jr.'s fitness and health promotion, even as this administration continues to talk about how one of its main objectives is to, quote unquote, protect women. And that ultimately what this video represents is just this sort of really dark and devious content that is akin to just the content we know from the far-right manosphere. Sort of a just debased and even violent form and representation of masculinity that is really menacing, and that is the ultimate message of this video. And so anyway, it's just a really smart piece. I recommend reading it. There's so much more here that the piece goes into, but I really encourage folks to listen to, or to read it from Natalia, or read it at MSNBC or MSN now, MS Now as it's now called, RFK Jr. and Kid Rock's Maha Manosphere Mashup.
I loved that piece, and I just want to say this is like totally irrelevant, but I think it's really weird that MSNBC renamed itself MS Now, because it's like Ms. and Now that are two acronyms for feminist organizations. Why did the marketing people not get that? It's so weird. Yeah, it's great. And, I also thought Kid Rock's body is so awful looking. And for an administration that cares so much about aesthetics, it's like, why would you put, why would you take a shirt off that body and show it to everybody? And the other thing I realized, just like several days after watching the video, is by whole milk, they mean raw milk.
Yes.
And, I drink whole milk, which is pasteurized and has fat in it because it tastes better, and that's why I do it. But they mean raw milk. And so where you see whole milk in Maha culture, they're talking about milk that has bugs in it, people. Okay, so the thing I want to go viral this week, I caught up on all my New Yorkers when I was in Puerto Rico.
Whoa.
I know. Well, you can throw them away and then your bags later when you come back. This was a piece by a guy named Charles Duhigg, and it's called What MAGA Can Teach Democrats About Organizing and Infighting, January 26, 2026, in the New Yorker. And it's about the difference between community-based activism and top-down political organizations. And what Duhigg points out is that one of the reasons the Republican Party has been so effective, dating back to the Tea Party movement, is they kind of seed these organizations and then they let them do whatever they want. And somehow it all comes together in a kind of voter mobilization. But local organizations are very attuned to local issues. And most importantly, these local organizations are creating leaders. So you have leaders emerging on these very small scale organizations and sort of becoming national figures as they discover their talents and as other people discover their talents. And I'm thinking of somebody like Jim Jordan, who was a wrestling coach, and he got involved in the Tea Party movement, and now he's a very powerful representative. So there are a number of people who came out of that movement. And Duhigg then points to what Democrats do, and he pointed to the example of Indivisible. And he said, Indivisible started as a network of local organizations. When the money came in, they then opened a big office in Washington. They spent a ton of the money not organizing, but supporting an administration in Washington that could coordinate all of these local groups. And Indivisible has not produced all of these leaders. And the reason I think this is really important is that the Democratic Party seems to be realizing somewhat belatedly that you can't run the same candidate everywhere. And that you need to actually find candidates that can agree on a number of things but disagree on other things that are attractive to their constituents, because the whole point is you are representing those constituents. You're not representing the National Democratic Party, and that's how you get people elected. And, I'm thinking of someone like Graham Plattner, who's gotten a lot of visibility in Maine. These sort of white working class guys, several of whom and several women have really done well in these special elections. And so it seems like maybe the Democratic Party is letting the leash run a little bit. But I think the final point that really made an impression on me was that Duhigg argues that conservatives are allowed to disagree with each other. And Democrats and liberals and the left generally see disagreement as a really bad thing. And that if you disagree on a really key issue like abortion or gay marriage or something like that you and I consider to be kind of foundational principles, if you have a candidate who doesn't believe in those things, they have to go. And I'm still chewing on this, but it did make me realize that the number of times I, as a liberal, have been made to feel unwelcome in a left political venue, as opposed to the number of times that I've gone into conservative venues or conservative Christian venues and felt immediately welcomed, regardless of the fact that we have grave differences. There really is a difference in terms of how the left and the right deal with disagreement. And I think it's something that we have to think about politically, not just on the electoral level, but on the level of how we deal with our networks and our friends and our neighbors.
I mean, I feel like we could do an entire episode on this very thing because I think it's hugely important. I think like it raises so many questions about where we are and how we got here. And, I've sort of had that experience as well in just sort of recognizing a degree of orthodoxy among the left that reminded me of just like the most extreme sort of fundamentalist Christianity, and just sort of being
Right.
really struck by the parallel there. But I think, and folks might disagree with this, but I feel like that sort of standard of orthodoxy feels much more sort of normalized across, or I guess normal across a much wider spectrum of the left than I think it exists on the right. And there's real repercussions for that, and we should talk about that more.
Yeah, we really should. And, I was actually thinking about your experiences with your book, the number of people who said to you, your book on conservative gays, well, you're not like one of them. You're not one of those conservatives, are you? Whereas conservative groups have invited you to speak, and they know you're gay.
Right.
And it's so, and Leah Wright Rigueur, a mutual friend of ours, had the same experience with her book on conservative black politics, The Loneliness of the Black Conservative, where people would assume she must be conservative, or they would ask a probing question to get her to identify herself.
Right.
And so there is this kind of fear of contamination on the left that I think you're right. We should do a whole episode on it if we can figure out how to frame it.
Definitely.
So, Neil, I think we're at the end of the show. It always comes. It always makes me sad. But I'm looking forward to seeing you next week.
Next time.
Next time. That's it for today's show. Thanks for hanging out with us. Share this podcast with a friend who loves history, politics, and smart conversation. You can follow Neil and me on Threads, Blue Sky, X, TikTok, and Instagram. Go to the Political Junkie Substack at clairepotter.substack.com for show notes, more episodes, to leave a comment or question, to subscribe for free, or to support our work for as little as $5 a month. You can also subscribe for free by searching for us on your favorite platform. If you do, please leave a rating and a comment so that other listeners can find us. Our podcast is supported by the New School for Social Research and by paying subscribers. Political Junkie is written, recorded, edited, and produced by me, Claire Potter. Today's theme is Mirror by New Alchemist. You can find their work and all the talented artists we feature on these episodes on Soundstripe. That's all for now. See you next week.